Welcome everybody to my home office. I'm Dr. D, and I wanted to go over a few concepts from the systems approach that seem to confuse a lot of students based on your answers for this week's assignment. So I wanted to quickly clarify this before you complete the case study because it seems like a lot of people really had trouble with some of these concepts. So the first concept I want to talk about is hierarchy, specifically hierarchical ordering. Now, in the classical approach, this is what we mean by hierarchy, right? In the classical approach, it's about strict hierarchy, who's at the top and who's commanding, right, those at the bottom. And so what I've actually drawn here is a network, or rather a chain of command, right, from the classical perspective, from a job that I used to have when I was a teenager, many moons ago. So names have been changed because I don't remember them. So this is what the classical approach will say when they're saying we're talking about hierarchy. This. But when we're not talking about the classical approach, when we're talking about the systems approach, this is no longer relevant. None of these lines matter in terms of the hierarchy. Actually, what matters is who talks to whom. This is a communication approach. And so now the classical hierarchy doesn't matter at all. What matters is what system is this embedded in, and what are the microsystems or the subsystems happening here. So let me kind of draw you what these nodes actually look like, because in this system, in this network, my nodes are people, right? So we've got each of these circles being a node, and now the links between those nodes are not these kind of like weird steps. They are just direct lines from one node to the other. So the kitchen manager definitely did talk directly with the snack bar supervisor and the catering head chef. But the thing is that he also talked with most of the other people here, because he was the kitchen manager. He was in charge of hiring everybody. So actually, this guy John talked to everyone. So what we have here are way more links, because he talked to us and he would say hello to us when we came into, like the office, into the kitchen. So we knew him. We knew him on a first name basis. He was the one who interviewed us all. He was the one who hired us, and he got to know us. All right. John was pretty professional, so nothing but good things about him so far. Now, that was for the snack bar side of things. There was also a catering side of things for this kitchen, which was a little bit more formal. And Bruce, being a head chef, was a very sort of different culture than those of us, right? This one's me, putting together burgers and fries and scooping ice cream. This was a different set of people, and so the relationships here were much different. John did, in fact, hire all of these people, so he's got links to all of these people as well. But Bruce was the one who had the most relationship with these people, right? So we have kind of thicker lines here. Now, I'm using a real life example, so you may be noticing some trends here where Natalie, Ileana, and Trish are the only women's names you're seeing here who have the lowest ranking positions, right? We see this in organizations all the time, and we'll talk about these kinds of things when we discuss critical theory. But we also see here only 2 Latino or Hispanic names, right? And that is pretty stereotypical of some organizations, especially kitchens, where you've got the 2 Hispanic or Latinos, in this case, who were dishwashers. So they actually, Carlos knew Mario, and Mario actually really barely spoke with John, and Carlos was hired, and then he basically got Mario hired, and I'm using this like real life example, and we're sort of seeing some demographic dynamics as described in chapter 1, right? True story. This is really what it looked like in this organization. Is this a good thing? That will be your opinion. When we talk about critical theory, that will be your opinion. But you could also say, well, the way that this communication happened and was organized could also be maybe a good thing or a not good thing. And that potentially could be your opinion to discuss in the systems case study. So that's your opinion to be had, right? Why are all the women over here only two male Hispanics? It's true that Ileana was Latina. Anyway, demographic issues playing out in a real life network of an organization. Let's point out here that Steve most often actually did not work with this staff, even though he was technically in charge of us. He most often acted as a cook or a chef, right, in the line. And so actually Bruce more or less acted like his boss and told him what to do. So there was a lot of this going on. Steve was also a total creep, and so he, would try to talk a lot to the young women in the kitchen, even though that was not his role. There was a lot of communication, one-way communication in this case. So hopefully you're seeing that when we're talking about a network, we're not talking about that traditional hierarchical system that the classical approach is talking about. We're talking about nodes and links between those nodes. And when we're talking about the hierarchical ordering in the systems approach, we're not talking about the who's got power and who doesn't. What we're talking about is that we actually kind of have two subsystems here, right? There's the catering kitchen. Can you see that that's a different color? And you've got the snack bar part of the kitchen, right? And so we have two systems: snack, catering. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about subsystems. These are not the people at the bottom of the structural hierarchy. These are the systems embedded in the system. So these are the subsystems. This whole thing is the system. Let me try to pull out another color here, right? That is the system, right? The kitchen. And I didn't really introduce you to this kitchen. This kitchen belonged to a country club. So the, super system here, which has, home office, which has a bunch of other systems, right, which are connected to this one. The super system then is the organization, the larger organization, the country club, right, which had other departments. There was a pool and there were tennis courts. And so when we're talking about the systems approach, this is what we mean by hierarchical ordering. I want to make a few other distinctions between the systems approach and the classical approach. So first, remember that the classical metaphor is the machine, and the systems metaphor is the system. So in the classical approach, we say we have all these different parts, and they're all doing their own jobs, and they're working together, right? And in the systems approach, we're saying it's friggin' messy. Look inside a human body, there's all of these different systems and they are all connected. And if one of these systems breaks down, it affects all the other systems. So when we're talking about hierarchical ordering, we're talking about what are all of the different body parts that fit into that bigger system? And some of those body parts sometimes belong to another system. For instance, your blood gets pumped by your heart in your circulatory system. And then your heart is also influenced by your lungs in your breathing system, right? And so the heart kind of plays a part in both of those systems, right? So it's not like at the top of the pyramid. Instead, it's embedded within two systems, which are in the larger super system of the human body. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about hierarchical ordering, when we're talking about the systems approach. In the classical approach, there's a hierarchy, but it's a totally different metaphor and therefore a totally different concept. It seems that most people understand concepts of permeability, holism, equifinality, but I did get a couple of questions about negative entropy. And so if we're using this system metaphor, imagine what would happen if we closed off our systems. If nothing else could come in and nothing else could come out, right? No air can come in, no food can come in, no water can come in, and nothing can come out. Okay, we're excrement, sure, but also sweat, also carbon dioxide. Imagine if everything shut down, right? Your body would entropy real quick. Even if we could still have air in and out, right? We're still gonna need that water and that food to come in, and we're still going to need things to come out. If your sweat and tears and excrement can't come out, that's bad for your body, and again, that system will entropy, it will fall apart. So if entropy is the idea that when you close off a system, it falls into decay and breaks down, negative entropy is the opposite. It means that as we continue to bring in things, the system continues to change, evolve, and grow. And so when we're talking about negative entropy, we're talking about evolution and growth of organizations. And so if somehow this gets stopped, right? Remember Weber in the classical approach said that closed systems are ideal. The systems approach says, no, that's crazy. Your system will never grow, evolve, and improve if you shut things off. And Weber was all about that. He was all about keeping things the same, having rules, maintaining order. And the systems approach says there's no such thing as order in systems. I mean, there's order, but it's not about following rules. Rules are never going to be able to be followed perfectly, precisely every time. There's too many variables for things to just happen in these really predictable ways. Predictability is not at all what the systems approach is about, right? But instead, it's about negative entropy, about growth, about change, about evolution. Okay, so hopefully some of these concepts are making a little bit more sense now that you're understanding that the classical approach and the systems approach really see the world in different ways, right? You saw how the little diagram totally changed when we essentially put on a new pair of sunglasses. When we put on that systems approach pair of sunglasses, we see totally different information. We're paying attention to different things, which of course now brings us to Carl Weick's sense-making theory. So Weick's sense-making theory is a systems approach theory, but it also has a lot of commonality with some of the theories we're going to talk about in the future that are centered on the social construction of reality, and kind of more interpretive ways of seeing the world. But anyway, he still takes this systems approach because he's talking about all of these different parts interacting and just how complicated and messy it can get when we're organizing. Now, just like the constitutive approach we'll talk about in the future, in 2 modules from now, Weick is not interested in organizations, but rather the process of organizing. He's not saying, okay, look, this is what an organization does, this is who they are, this is the parts of it. He says, look, I don't care. Take away the lines, take away the bubbles that say that this counts and that doesn't count. everything can count, everything is information, and actually the world that we think we live in is based entirely on how we perceive the world. And so Wyke is using his own sunglasses metaphor, and he's saying organizations enact their environments. They create their worlds by paying attention to some things and ignoring other things. So if you had a job before the pandemic, think about how your bosses and your boss's bosses or the organizational messaging talked about the changes that were going to happen during the pandemic, right? Okay, so now we have to wear masks. Okay, right? Is this a thing that we're paying attention to? This disease is highly communicable, right? Lots of people can easily catch it. Is this information that we're going to pay attention to? Different organizations interpreted this new information really differently. And that's what's interesting about enacting our environment, is that different people perceive the same information different ways. And part of that is because some people only pay attention to certain parts and different people pay attention to different parts of the information. So we end up seeing the same thing, but taking away different parts of the big picture and only focusing our attention on certain parts of the big picture. I think in the United States right now, the best example you're going to see of this is politics, where we kind of all live in literally the same world, but it doesn't feel like we live in the same world. Figuratively, we're living in different worlds because we're seeing that world in very different ways. And some of that is because of equivocal information. So equivocal information is information that needs to be interpreted, that needs to be made sense of somehow. So equivocal information, a lot of equivocal information was coming in the early days of COVID-19. We were finding out new information and we were getting a lot of new data, right? We were finding out, right, how does this spread? Oh, does it spread through touching? Does it spread through contact? Does it spread through like saliva? How is this getting from one person to another? How is it that so many people are getting infected and we don't even realize until days and days later? And when the researchers started digging into this, they were spewing out so much information at us that it was almost overwhelming. It was almost too much information without a lot of sense, right? And making sense of all of this information, deciding which information to pay attention to is how we enact our environment, and then deciding what we're going to do about that information, what that information actually means for us, right? That is reducing equivocality. So I find out that lots and lots of people are getting sick. How do I interpret that? I might choose to interpret that as, well, that means that this is dangerous and we need to do something about it. We all need to act. Everybody needs to act right now. We need to start by hiding away from each other so we can stop the spread, right? And so on, going down that path. And another interpretation, right, another way of reducing that equivocality might be, look, lots of people are getting sick, but most of the people end up being fine, right? The majority of people don't die. And so why do we need to react to this in any way differently than we've reacted to, the cold or the flu? In fact, right, maybe the flu is still much more dangerous than this COVID-19 business. And so maybe we really shouldn't be doing anything. Why are you making me hide in my home? Why are you making me put cloth on my face when I don't see what the point is? This isn't any different than anything I've seen before. And so what we're seeing here are two very different interpretations of the same information, two different ways to reduce equivocality. And so what you end up with are actually two different sense-making processes, which have different assembly rules. And so for some people, the assembly rule was every time there's new information, I pause, I step away, I behave in cautious ways, right? I protect myself and others more by creating more physical distance. right? And trying to process that information and reduce equivocality in that way. And other folks said when there's new information that comes in, I'm not going to be reactionary. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions. I'm going to continue living the way I've been living my entire life. And I'm not going to make any changes because of some new tiny piece of information. And so we have these very different assembly rules, right? How much do I react to new information? One assembly rule is I react a lot, very strongly, because lives are at stake. And the other assembly rule was I don't react very strongly because we don't even know if lives are at stake. And in fact, the economy is at stake if we do keep jumping to big conclusions and changing our behaviors dramatically. So you're seeing these two very different interpretations of the same information. And what we actually have really are two processes of organizing that are very different. And you could, if you don't like this model, say, okay, this represents two organizations, right? It represents the Democrats and the Republicans, right? And their ways of processing information and of organizing around these ideas. But Weick says, stop trying to focus on the organizations and instead focus on the process of organizing. What are people doing? How are people responding to this information? And so for Weick, it's about that paying attention to the information and enacting your environment that way, then reducing equivocality by choosing certain interpretations, and then how did I get to those interpretations? And for Weick, it's through communication. Very few people kind of completely isolated communicatively, right? That's why we had all those Zoom happy hours. People needed that communication, needed to make sense of things together. And so for some, their new assembly rules were, I'm not going to reduce equivocality until I've talked with somebody, unless I've had a conversation, right? And Weick says that's exactly what happens. We communicate to reduce equivocality, and that is where organizations come from, but mostly that's the process of organizing. It's this process of communicating to reduce equivocality, and then the kind of mental shortcuts and rules that we make for how we communicate. Right? How do I go up to somebody and just start talking about this? Do I ask questions? Kind of what attitude do I try to have while I'm communicating? What are the rules that I use to communicate? And then through our process of communication, what rules do we come up with? What assembly rules are we coming up with to make sense of this equivocal information? So that's Carl Weick's idea, and you can see how there's lots of moving parts, right? And so you can communicate with one group and then you might communicate with a different group, and the combination of those conversations is going to reduce equivocality in a unique way to you, right? And so organizing is really quite complicated because there's tons of these different moving parts. They're all related, and there's clearly this hierarchical ordering of the information and of the way that it's processed. But it's not about the hierarchy of, well, who's the head of the organization and who's their subordinate. That's totally unrelated. Weick doesn't care at all. Who are the heads of the organization, right? He's interested in the process of organizing through communication. Hopefully this was clarifying for you. Hopefully it makes sense now what the systems approach is trying to say and how it's different from the previous approaches that we've talked about. Your textbook lumps systems approach and cultural approach together in one chapter, which I don't think makes any sense. The cultural approach is really very different from the systems approach, where the systems approach is really interested in all of these different intersecting parts, how they're related to one another, how they inform one another, and just how messy and complicated organizations are. They are not these neat organized cogs all working together to produce a product, right? There's way more to it than that. Those cogs are related to those cogs and these cogs, and the cogs not only have emotions, right? When we're talking about the human approaches, but they also have their own weird thoughts and processes and decision-making skills and sense-making processes, and organizing is really about how all of these things interact, and it's more about organizing than organizations, at least for one of the theorists that we talked about. And when we're looking at these networks, right, how do all of these pieces come together? Who's at the center of these networks, right? Is it an organization? If we're looking at a network of organizations, that what's the organization that's at the center of things? Usually when we're looking at networks of people, of individual people, who's at the center of things? What kind of power do they have? Oh, power. That's something that's going to come up in a later approach when we're talking about the feminist and critical approaches. So it's starting to get messier, it's starting to get more complicated, and it's starting to really center communication. Because in networks, it's all about who communicates with whom, what direction is that communication flowing in, right? When we're talking about the theory kind of abstractly, yes, we're talking about hierarchical ordering, and we're talking about permeability, but part of that permeability is the communication input that's coming and the communication process that's the throughput, right? And potentially even the communication output. And when we're talking about Carl Weick, it's all about communication. The entire process of organizing centers on communication. We make sense of our world through communication, and that is the process of organizing. So in other words, communication finally becomes central to this approach. This is the first real communicative approach that we're talking about. And you can look forward to there being much more communication-centered ideas in this and following approaches. All right, see you online.